Hello, I'm Rob Hopkins, and it's a huge honour to have been asked to be your final presenter. I imagine you've already seen so many presenters that I'm really quite the last thing you want to see. I hope there might be just room for one more. So the first thing I want to say is thank you. You've had quite a time of it, bombarded with complex information, immersed in concepts and science that may have led you to having sleepless nights. My own experience when I really got climate change was like what the mystics back through history have called a dark night of the soul. This is an area of knowledge that can bring with it a burden of despair, hopelessness, grief. I have huge respect to you all for taking up this challenge on behalf of your fellow citizens and bringing your best selves to figuring this stuff out. I'm not here to tell you whether your target should be 2030, 2040, 2050. That's not for me to say. I've only been to Jersey once. I gave a talk about the urgent imperative to move away from oil and gas dependency and what we could create instead, and was then talked about in the letters page of the island's newspaper for days as if I was the most idealistic and dangerous person ever to set foot on the island. So I'm delighted to see that things are really starting to change and these issues are being taken seriously. The main thing I want to talk about here is longing. What's longing got to do with climate change, you might be wondering? Well, all too often our discussions around the climate and ecological emergency focus on how irreplaceable what we need to leave behind is, rather than being able to paint a picture of the future we could still create that is so delicious and exquisite that we'll do everything we possibly can to get there. Imagine we were standing on top of a mountain, and the guides at our side were pointing to the dark and dangerous looking storm clouds heading rapidly in our direction. For some of us, we're happy to accept the guides' advice. They're the guides, after all, right? They know this mountain. We trust their advice. For a lot of people, though, that doesn't seem to be working. I wonder then if a better strategy might be to tell the stories of the valleys that await us when we get down. The lower grassy slopes, the warm firesides, the delicious meals, fine wines, comfortable beds, the dry socks that await us when we get there. Then our work becomes not that of trying to convince people with facts and figures, but rather trying to cultivate a longing for a low-carbon future, and that is the work of imagination and storytelling. I spend a lot of time thinking about the future and hearing people's ideas of how the future could be if it turned out that we were to spend the next 10 or 15 years doing everything we possibly could. What if the Jersey Citizens Assembly of 2021 was the moment in history that people look back to as marking the beginning of a process that profoundly transformed Jersey for the better? We can already see some of the bold actions being rolled out in France as a result of theirs. When I ask people to join me in my imaginary time machine and to travel to a 2030, that is the result of our having done everything we possibly could have done, whether in workshops or in big events with 1,500 people, or when I ask the guests on my podcast series that same question and do that same exercise with them, it's amazing how consistent their responses are. And I've come to feel like this exercise is hugely important. Why? Because as the poet Rilke once wrote, the future enters into us in order to transform itself in us a long time before it happens. So what are some of the things that people tell me they see? They speak about a future in which the dawn chorus is so much louder and the birdsong much more noticeable everywhere we go. They tell me how the air smells so much cleaner, like spring. The seas are now so clean that people can swim to work. People are so much healthier than they were in 2021. There's less anxiety, less stress. People feel part of a shared collective purpose of working together to put things right. Food is more central to our lives. Our rural landscapes are a more diverse tapestry of different things being grown, and more people work in food production. Most of our energy comes from renewables, and a lot of that is in community ownership, being seen as a safer and more profitable investment than banks. Jersey's finance sector reimagined itself and is now one of the principal drivers towards ethical green finance in the world, investing massively in the shift underway in Jersey and elsewhere around the world, recognising that money would have no value on a dying planet. Jersey's Green New Deal, initiated in 2022, created so many jobs on the island doing the work that needed to be done, insulating homes, installing renewable energy systems, planting trees, enhancing rural biodiversity and wildlife. Schools became showcases for the future, powered by renewables, in grounds filled with gardens, practical training for those practical skills, less based on tests, more based on nurturing imaginative and practical young people. The island became more democratic and transparent, with neighbourhood assemblies and more regular neighbourhood assemblies as well. Our pensions became a portfolio of investment in community shares, in the new different organisations that have come to shape life on the island. There's more time, more space. In the larger towns, more streets are closed and used instead for trees, for community, for spaces for kids to play. The island now measures its progress not by GDP, but by its declining carbon footprint. The number of girls now able to cycle home on their own after dark. The number of children playing outdoors. The number of people employed in putting the world right rather than hastening its demise. The number of people employed in increasing the diversity of the nation's wildlife, of the island's wildlife, and in the diversity of that wildlife itself, and the percentage of food eaten in Jersey that was grown on Jersey. Public transport is now amazing and free, and cycling is safe and delightful. I could go on, and often do. And most of you might think a lot of this sounds utopian or idealistic somehow, but I can tell you that most of this is already happening somewhere. In Denmark, people already invest in community-owned wind turbines as a better investment than the bank. In Paris, large parts of the city have been closed to cars and open to all manner of creative community uses. In Liège, in Belgium, they're reimagining the city's food system based on the question, what if in a generation's time the majority of food eaten in Liège came from the land closest to Liège? And so on, and so on. As William Gibson once wrote, the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed. I share this imagining of a future that's still possible just because we cannot build what we cannot imagine. If we don't make the space, as you have done over the last few weeks, to dare to imagine things could be different, then we definitely won't ever create it. How many people, for example, in the Ministry of Defence are actively imagining a peaceful world and how to get there? How many people in the Ministry of Justice are actively imagining a world without prisons and the steps we might take to get there? Unless we intentionally create those what-if spaces, those conversations never happen. One of my heroes, the great American prison abolition activist Mariame Kaba, wrote in her latest book, "We live in a system that has been locked into a false sense of inevitability." The bravery, the courage, the clarity of purpose that you guys can set is hugely important. Do we want to aim for the stars or settle for something less? You have been presented with what Martin Luther King called the fierce urgency of now, and I really urge you to seize it. One of the things that might help you here is that the imagination loves limits. You will have all read, either as kids or with your kids, Green Eggs and Ham by Dr. Seuss. He wrote that book after being set a challenge by his publisher to write a book that just contains 50 words. He said afterwards that it was the most imaginative thing he ever did. Limits offer our imagination a structure, a space in which to thrive. And these times absolutely impose limits. I see again and again in places that I visit across Europe who are doing transition work that it is those who recognise the limits of our times who are coming up with the most imaginative solutions. Jersey is no exception. If you can find the right blend of ambition, clarity, and a vision of the future that can create longing, those limits become an opportunity rather than a hindrance. I also see it in those people who are doing this work. I see in them an aliveness, a determined stubbornness, combined with a sense of having found their life's purpose that I rarely find elsewhere. What if Jersey became the model of a sustainable future? What if it were a showcase for enlightened economics, passionate entrepreneurs, a reimagined relationship with the natural world? What if it showcased new models for generating energy, housing people, feeding everyone? What if the next 10 years on Jersey felt like living through a revolution of the imagination? What if the bravery and vision that Jersey came to embody meant that future generations would look back and tell great tales and sing great songs about those people who could see what was coming and responded with such resilience and vision. I started by talking about longing, and I will close by saying that it is my longing that in 10 years' time I might get to visit Jersey and see it thus transformed. Having travelled there by low-carbon airship, a spectacular adventure, and having walked around the island and seen the most vibrant, connected, beautiful place I have ever seen, I would then sit beneath an apple tree with a glass of that amazing stuff you make in Jersey that's like Bailey's, but it's made with Jersey cream and apple brandy, and raise a glass to toast those brave and brilliant people back in 2021 in the Jersey Citizens Assembly who played such a key role in enabling all of this. Thank you.